Welcome to Grounded. We're so excited to have you here joining with us in our home. And today we're going to be studying in the Book of Mormon, Enos through Mormon. In these chapters, we are going to find a family situation, a family relationship. And within this family relationship, we're going to be looking at three main principles or truths. The first is the nurture and admonition of the Lord, then the hunger and wrestle, and followed by preserving the covenant language of God. Welcome to Grounded, where women of all ages, nationalities, and backgrounds gather together with me, Barbara Morgan Gardner, and my guest, as we strive to build a bedrock understanding of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and become more like him. We are thrilled to have our dear friend, Jenet Erickson, with us today in our home. Thank you, Jenet, for being here.
Love being here. Thank you, Barb.
Thank you. Jenet, President Nelson has talked recently about our primary identities, and he tells us that we are all children of God, children of the covenant, and then disciples of Jesus Christ. So I'd like just to kind of set that as a stage to understanding who we are. In addition to those primary identities, Jenet, how would you describe yourself? How can we get to know you a little bit better?
Oh, thank you. I am so delighted to talk about family today, Barb. My PhD is in family science, as you know, and I've loved teaching the eternal family class at BYU as part of the religious education faculty. I'm a mother and a wife. We have 2 children, so grateful for them. I laugh that the others never showed up because they saw me as a mother and were like, maybe not. I've learned so much being a mother and so grateful to be married. But then to come from a family, I'm the 5th of 11 children and 9 girls. And so a lot of feelings and thoughts about women, our roles, our gifts, our place in God's plan. And that will be part of what we talk about today as well.
Jenet, thank you. We're starting right off, as we said, jumping into the book of Enos. And Jenet, I would just like you, if you would mind, just kind of walking us through there. You mentioned family a little bit. Can you guide us through these chapters a little bit here?
Yeah, boy, Barb, I mean, when you start with Enos, it's like you feel he's talking to you as a person and reaching right through to you and wanting to tell you about his story. But it's really, this section of scriptures, I was amazed, is 400 years of history. 7 writers, these intergenerational writers who are passing on this record and the covenant with it.
Wow.
And so it really is the story of the covenant here. Enos will teach us that in his prayer, but it's connecting covenant and family together. And this truth that families can be reclaimed. Like you see this rupture in the covenant of this story of Lehi's family. And Mormon is going to wrestle with that all the way through as he's writing this record, and the absolute assurance in this covenant that the Lord will restore his children and that he will bring back. So it's not only is the rupture in the family, but the restoration happens through the family as well. And that brings all of us such assurance in the stories of our own families and in the grand story of the great family, how in God's hands he has a plan to restore his children, to bring us back into access to truth.
Janet, that is absolutely beautiful. As I was looking through this, I thought of Enos and who he is, and the recognition that Enos is Jacob's son, but that makes Nephi his uncle, and Laman and Lemuel his uncles.
Yes,
and Lehi and Sariah they're his grandparents.
These are not distant relationships.
Yes, this separation that we're looking at in the book of Enos already. These are his first cousins. Yeah. These are people that when he's saying that he's crying to the Lord and he wants to be able to reach out to those family members, he's talking about first himself praying to the Lord and receiving that remission, but then he also wants to gather his own people that are still with him. Yeah. And then he reaches out for this bigger group. When you look at this bigger group, he's talking about his own family. Yeah. And then he sees, and I'm sure he knows, the spread of this family throughout. And then I love your tie-in back to Mormon and Moroni as we get to the words of Mormon. So thank you. The Book of Mormon continues to be a family book.
It's a book of family, yes. And I think you laid out the 3. It feels like what he's doing for us as he's teaching us, as you said, he's discovering himself in relation to God and that secure relationship and redemption. And then he's finding his place in regard to this family. And then he's finding his place. God is teaching him his place in the covenant, his place in the story of the covenant, which is true for all of us. When you hear President Nelson's call, it's as if he's telling us, find your place as Enos did in the grand story of this covenant gathering.
So beautiful, Jenet. And I think that if it's okay, that takes us right into chapter of Enos. There's only one chapter of Enos. So Enos chapter 1. And I love just verse 1. Enos is letting us into his life a little bit, and he's raw. That's one of the things I love about Enos is he is saying that, he's having a wrestle with God. But before that, he's going to teach us something that I think is important. And Jenet, this is something that you have studied and taught extensively. So I want to bring this phrase in and then let you kind of run with it a little bit. He says, "Behold, it came to pass that I, Enos, knowing my father, that he was a just man, for he taught me in his language, and also in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And blessed be the name of my God for it." That the word nurture and admonition, or those words, really stood out to me. And I naturally went to the family proclamation, the word nurture, and just some insights. And can you just kind of guide us through perhaps even what this means, the nurture and admonition, why it's important? What can you teach us here?
Yeah, it's such powerful language. I remember the first time reading this and hearing the language in the proclamation that says parents have a sacred duty to rear their children in love and righteousness. And I think what you're hearing in nurture and admonition is that the nurture is this nourishing, right? It's whatever is needed to enable life to grow and thrive. And then you have this admonition that's this instructional side that's giving direction. And in some ways, it's like the warmth and the structure together.
Yeah.
And when we look at parenting, there's no question that across all the parenting research, effective parenting is found in structure and warmth. We'll call it authoritative parenting. And what it facilitates for children is a clarity of boundary and structures and even expectations. And then it is all filled with love and assurance of belonging and that you are mine and that I love you. And that combination of the structure that helps give clarity and boundaries and direction with the love is the soil that enables thriving to happen. But you're highlighting something beautiful as well by saying here in the proclamation, women are given primary responsibility for the nurture of their children. And then it says, in these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers assist one another as equal partners. So they're both invested in this work of nurturing, but her unique gifts and responsibilities and privileges endow her with a capacity to create that nurturing soil on which children thrive. And there's lots to say about the power of women in that work.
Jenet, to your point, I was thinking about nurturing. I actually looked up in the Webster's Dictionary in 1820. I always just love going there.
The 1828.
Yep. And it's interesting in that definition, we have the first definition is to feed and to nourish.
Yes.
The second definition is to educate, to bring up and to train. So I love that idea of nurturing. And I also found in the scriptures in Ephesians chapter 6 is the only other place I could find the word nurture.
Yeah. And it also has nurture and admonition.
Yes, together. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, thank you. And in there, it just simply says, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Mm-hmm. I just thought that was powerful, that it's, as you mentioned, it's the parents, it's the husband, the wife, it's the mom and the dad that are bringing up the children together in this way, both doing it in order to create this atmosphere as you've discussed.
Yeah.
Can you help us maybe understand why this is so important, Jenet?
Pattern. I was thinking, Barb, of, first of all, there's no question that a little soul that's born is like a new plant that requires light and sun and all of those things in order to water and soil in order to grow. And that's what I think the structure. So we'll talk about the importance of routines and the importance of traditions in family life that connect people every day. So the way that you like practices like family prayer and scripture study, we actually see in research are very powerful. And they provide a point of connection with the divine and with one another that is a stabilizing influence emotionally and in that direction of growth. But you could fixate, in a sense, on the practices. You could fixate on like the checklist, and goodness knows as a parent, there's such a strong sense of responsibility.
Yes.
And failure, because it's inherently, it's too big for any of us, in the sense that we're just growing up ourselves and trying to facilitate the nourishment and nurturing of other people. And you want to be perfect at it. You don't want them to be in pain. You want them to be on the path and stay on the path. And that journey of offering what you can in its imperfection and trying to do better, and then realizing, but I am not the one who will save them.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other beautiful thing that Enos is teaching us about the teachings of his parents. And I'm going to say his parents because there's no question his mother was involved in his teaching.
Yeah.
And then his own individual wrestle. And so it's like we have to do all we can to provide the nourishing soil, knowing that it will be their wrestle with God to know him and find him. And that is an individual journey for each of them, even as it is for each of us, and even as we're doing our best to provide the soil that they can grow in.
I just thought that at this moment, as I was sitting at the table with our girls the other day, we were getting ready for swim team, and we tried to study our scriptures beforehand, and we were preparing for Easter, and we were talking about Jesus Christ cleansing the temple, and we showed the church video of Christ cleansing the temple, and little Jane, she's 8, she was watching it, and she goes, Mom, if you hadn't cleansed the temple like that, it probably wouldn't have been so messy.
Because he's knocking tables over and
and I just sat there and looked at her. It was like one of those moments where, you're right, Jane. There probably could have been a better way to clean the temple than what was. I don't really know what that means, but it was just this moment of, we try so hard as parents to try to teach correctly, but sometimes
it's getting in. And
she just looked at me like, duh, And then a few minutes later, she points out that I can't remember how many times the scriptures that we were reading. She's like, it says 8 times God and 5 times Lord. And you just like
what they're paying attention to.
What are you doing? Our goal is to just to kind of keep her in her chair most of the time. Like just to kind of keep her somewhere with us,
Yes.
But it is hard being parents, being teachers, aunts, I think as women, we're trying so hard to nurture.
Yes.
I love what you're saying there, that we are also in the process of growing. There's nothing like having our children, and you brought it out perfectly with Enos, our children repenting in the process of us repenting.
Yes.
How many times have I expected my children to say they were sorry or learn a lesson, when in the process I'm also saying, and I'm sorry that I was so impatient with you as you're trying to learn the lesson, And I think I have said that phrase.
Effort.
Yes.
Repenting together. We're both being in this process of growing.
Yeah.
Barb, I feel like President Uchtdorf's, Elder Uchtdorf's beautiful talk for us on parenting, where he says, Jesus Christ is the strength of parents. Just think there would be no other way except by his help. Yeah. He'll even say, I love how he says, he is with you. He stands beside you. He is your strength in guiding your children to make righteous choices. He is your strength as a parent. But don't you love how he says, building faith in a child is somewhat like helping a flower to grow. And I picture Jacob teaching Enos.
Yeah, that's good.
And you cannot tug on the stem to make it taller. You cannot pry open the bud to get it to blossom sooner. And you cannot neglect the flower and expect it to grow or flourish spontaneously. What you can and must do for this rising generation is provide rich, nourishing soil with access to flowing heavenly water. Remove weeds and anything that would block heavenly sunlight. Create the best possible conditions for growth. Patiently allow the rising generation to make inspired choices. And then he says, and let God work his miracle.
Wow.
And I think there's Jacob, right, planting truths in this son Enos. And years later, Enos is reflecting on the truths that were planted deeply in that soil. And it's coming to fruit in his life at a time later than when they were first planted.
Absolutely. Jenet, I had a couple of thoughts on that as well. Recently I had a chance to talk with a past General Relief Society president, and we were talking about her responsibilities. And then she made a comment to me about raising children, and she just said, how are you doing as a mother? And I just kind of laugh, as I always do, and she just kind of laughed a little too. And she said, being the General Relief Society president of the church was nothing compared
to being a mother.
Being a mother was much more taxing, much more difficult, much more hands-on all the time. And then I told that story to another General Relief Society president. She also then laughed, and then she just simply said, "She's right, Just this, and again, I'm always careful, and I think you and I are especially sensitive to this. We were not mothers until we were, for many, a little bit older. I have just become a mother. I know you were a little bit older as well. My children are both adopted, and to just make the point, we're not just talking about nurturing our own children in the home, which is extremely important, but we're also talking about nurturing as women I'm so grateful for my brothers and sisters that allowed me to be a part of nurturing my nephews and nieces. I'm grateful for the parents who have allowed me to take their children on trek, for War to Stake activities. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be a teacher and to teach the scriptures. And all of us have a different life. I'm grateful for the nurses and the doctors and the psychologists and all these people who have nurtured my children, my family along the way.
What would we do without them?
Yeah, what would we do without them?
This whole effort. And it seems like Enos is going to be so instructive about that. Not unlike Sister Du saying to us, right? We are mothers before we were born.
Right.
And that was the name given Eve before she ever bore children, because it is the work of nourishing souls. And there's so many spheres in which that happens. So Enos himself is going to look way beyond his own life and his cousins, right? And look to this grand story in the covenant of the great eternal family, of which there is no end, right, to the work that we can do to assist God in nurturing his children.
Absolutely. And you're bringing us to Enos, and you talk about Adam and Eve a little bit as well. I'm going to bring in a quote that I love from President Eyring, and he's talking in this about the women's role in nurturing, which I just think it's fantastic. He says, he's talking about women's primary role as nurturers.
Yes.
And then he says, you might ask, how does that make faithful sisters a primary force to help the Lord pour out knowledge on his saints? He says, the Lord gives answers in the family of proclamation to the world, which you just talked about. He says, you remember the words, but you may see new meaning and recognize that the Lord foresaw these exciting changes, which are now occurring. In the proclamation, he gave sisters charge to be the principal gospel educators in the family. In these words, mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. This includes the nurture of gospel truth and knowledge. And then he continues, why then does a daughter of God in united and equal relationship receive the primary responsibility to nourish with the most important nutrient all must receive, a knowledge of truth coming from heaven? And then he continues, as nearly as I can see, that has been the Lord's way since families were created in this world. For instance, and then he goes to Eve. It was Eve who received the knowledge that Adam needed to partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge for them to keep all of God's commandments and to form a family. I do not know why it came to Eve first, but Adam and Eve were perfectly united when the knowledge was poured out upon Adam. I just love this idea of women and nurturing. Even before Eve had children of her own, she was already nurturing the future generation.
In gospel truth.
Yes.
I just was quoting that for students yesterday, Barb, because we were talking about presiding and nurturing.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this before. I love hearing you talk about Dustin. And here you are, this gospel teacher.
Yeah.
And what it means to have his presence as you teach your children, that he brings. And the only way presiding is not a president. It's not the decision maker. It doesn't mean that he has access to revelation you don't have access to.
Absolutely.
But there's a presence that he brings that facilitates you being able to be a primary gospel instructor. And when I asked students, who is asked to be the primary gospel instructor, they did not know. It's sort of, because when we have in scripture, we have Jacob teaching Enos and Enos teaching Jerem. And we, all throughout scripture, it seems like it's father to children being the primary gospel instructor.
Right.
And yet from the beginning, we're seeing Eve was given that instruction in President Eyring's clarifying language. And that means this presiding and teaching role together is what facilitates this magnification of the truth in the lives of children. And that depends on women knowing scriptures, talking about scriptures, right?
I love this in verse 11, bringing us back to Enos, where he says, and after Enos had heard these words, my faith began to be unshaken in the Lord. And I prayed unto him with many long strugglings for my brethren, the Lamanites. I love this idea that his faith was unshaken. And that's kind of what we're doing here with Grounded, is just this idea that we are firmly planted. In fact, in Luke chapter 6, verse 48, when he's talking about the wise man that built his house upon the rock, he actually says in there that he had to dig deep. So when he's building that house, he was digging deep. And I think as mothers and fathers, as women, we need to be able to really dig deep, to be solidly grounded. So when that wind comes, which it will come, no matter, there is no bubble thick enough. Not that we even want to create a bubble, but if we did, there's no bubble thick enough. We have to help our children to be spiritually self-reliant and to be able to dig deep. And I love how you talked about, we're trying to create their children so that they can do it for themselves. That the analogy from Elder Uchtdorf was just beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. So inspired. So does that lead us, Barb, to this question? Here's you've got Enos, and he has this wrestle.
Yeah.
And thinking that we all, in a sense, we all will have to wrestle. He starts by talking about, I want to tell you about the wrestle that I had before God. And he's going to talk about this wrestle before he receives a remission of his sins. So in verse 2 and then verse 3, we get to that remission of sins. And it's interesting, that language wrestle, because we hear it in Jacob, the great patriarch Jacob, who then has a wrestle before God. And we hear it, it's interesting, the prophet Joseph talks about it with Zacharias, this wrestle as he goes into the temple to secure the blessing of a son that had been promised, he felt. And I love how Brigham Young also says, all of us are upon the same ground. We must struggle, wrestle, and strive. And this is the promise, until the Lord bursts the veil and suffers us to behold his glory, or a portion of it. And so sometimes when you're in the struggle of life, right, you're trying. I remember my mom, 11 children, and this effort to keep her covenants, and waking up maybe 4 or 5 years ago in the midst of many grandchildren, and life supposed to be about resting. Right?
Yeah, right.
And she said, I woke up and I thought to myself and said aloud, where are the promises? As she observed the struggles within just the mortal journey of her own children. And I think we can be in that place of like, does the wrestling end? And it's beautiful. I love President Brigham Young's promise. As we do that, he will burst the veil and suffer us, allow us to behold his glory. And that's what Enos is going to do. So it leads us right to his journey then, how he says, you're wondering, well, what does he remember that his father taught?
Yeah.
And he says, I had often heard my father speak concerning eternal life and the joy of the saints, and that sunk deep into my heart. Now I think about my children. What are they going to remember that I tell them? And I would love if they remembered the joy of the saints and eternal life, right? As opposed to like, do this and do that. And
it's actually a good reminder, Jenet, because sometimes I think, I will be talking to them thinking, I am
at my wit's end here trying to.
They're going to think to themselves, the true principle my mother is teaching me is, if I read my scriptures every day, and if I follow, and if I go to church, then I will be frustrated and impatient like she is.
Oh, good. I want that life.
Isn't that true though? Sometimes
true.
I have to remind myself sometimes, Barb.
Yes.
Barb.
Live the joy.
Yes. Let them see the joy of the gospel, right?
But do you think, Barb, I think it's interesting how we can, one of the things I think Enos is doing for me is we can be doing all of these things, right? We're in the church pews, we're reading scriptures, and we might not be experiencing the joy. In fact, I think probably most of us, right?
Yeah.
Are at a place where we're like, what was this for? What was this about? And we're walking with Enos, and it's that recognition that I am still hungry.
Yeah.
Like there's something outside of me that I need. And it's not happening, right?
I'm a little lost.
I'm lost. I'm not in harmony or in sync with the divine light that this is supposed to be bringing me.
I often hear people say, like, what is my purpose even here? As a mom, what is my purpose?
Yes.
I'm doing all these things for people, or as a
trying
woman,
to do
like
what I'm supposed to. And,
trying to just get things done.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm hungering.
Yeah.
And
it's a real hunger, Jenet.
It's a real hunger. Yeah. No, I think, and acknowledging that. And I think we can be afraid, like, right, but aren't I doing all the things that I'm supposed to be doing? And shouldn't I be full?
Yes, exactly. And especially when things are lacking.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I know as being single, I hungered to be not having children. I hunger. And there's just this hunger that was like this unfulfilled sometimes.
Yes.
When we focus on what we don't have.
Yes.
And not that that's bad. It's just I think, and frankly, I think it's very healthy that we recognize that there is a longing.
There is a longing that is almost inherent to mortality.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And we could say, I think others would say, there's this inherent yearning for home, yearning for the eternal home.
Yeah. Well said.
That's not satiated all the way.
Yeah.
But Enos is going to tell us this beautiful, as he's hungering and he cries in mighty prayer and supplication. It's like he's acknowledging, I am hungry. I'm trying to do things and I'm still hungry. And the Lord comes and says, Enos, thy sins are forgiven. And then he says, I knew then that God could not lie and my sins had been forgiven, but I still am burdened with the gap between where I'm supposed to be and where I am. And then it says his guilt was swept away. Like he didn't have those like, I'm I'm still not who I need to be. I'm still not it's like the Lord said, I've swept it away. And then he says to him, go and do. Go to. So verse 8, right?
Yep.
Thy faith hath made thee whole because of Jesus Christ. This is the being who will satiate that hunger. And then how he says, now you have been filled, go to. And then we get to see what that means, right? What does this mean? This being made whole, and that leads to his pouring out of his whole soul, right? It's
absolutely. And what he wants there is he's hoping for this forgiveness. And Jenet, you brought in this point. I remember in verse 4 where you talked about how he cries unto the Lord all the day.
Yes.
And it still raised my voice high until it reached the heavens, and there came a voice unto me. I just remember reading this as a maybe a child or a teenager, I don't know, a young adult, and just thinking, wow, what must have that been like to cry unto God all day?
Yeah.
And now I look back and I just think, been there, done that.
That's happened
many times.
Where I need.
Yes.
I need.
Don't you think it's a constant cry? I mean, I think we get to this point where we're saying we recognize. There's a point where we recognize. And Enos is learning this point, but it's kind of going through this wilderness experience where we recognize we are 100% completely dependent upon the Lord, and we are crying to him all the time now. And we need his help, and we've recognized it.
Which it seems like, Barb, we could look at this and we could say, because I think youth, right, you could be in a youth program where they're like, let's do the Enos experiment.
Let's go pray all day.
Let's go pray all day. And it's so interesting to think this is happening ongoing.
Yeah.
So it's as if we partake of the sacrament. We're hungry because we know we cannot do it without him. And then he says, I will sweep away your guilt.
Yeah.
And then go forward. And then we're back sacrament meeting the next Sunday. I'm hungry again. And he says, I'll do it again, right? I'm here and enable you to continue to grow and become all yours. So it's not a one and done thing, right? I don't think Enos is trying to communicate that. This is a pattern over and over again that repeats itself in this wrestle, in this hungering, in this being full. Go to.
Yeah. And Jenet, this wrestle is real. I know you've said this, but I'm thinking now in terms of really he's trying to repent. And then he's also going to struggle in the spirit for those he loves.
Yes.
And then he's going to struggle in the spirit for his family. I mean, I love the word desire that we see there in verse 12.
Yes.
I mean, so we see in verse 11, first of all, we already read that, but he's talking about the struggling for my brethren.
Yes.
In verse 12, it came to pass that after I had prayed and labored with all diligence, the Lord said unto me, I will grant unto thee according to thy desires. Because of thy faith. And then 13, and now behold, this was the desire which I desired of him, that it should be so that my people, the Nephites, should fall into transgression and by any means be destroyed, that the Lamanites should not be destroyed. I mean, now you're seeing this love.
Yes.
So at first it's very, it's internal. He's trying to receive this remission of his sins.
Yes. Personal.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now he's going, his circle's getting expanding. And as he recognizes the power of God, I believe, and who God is and his ability to forgive, now he wants that for the people that he loves, his Nephites. And now it's expanded to the point where he says, if the Lamanites, I want the Lamanites to be able to have this record. And then he finishes that perhaps they might be brought unto salvation. And then he describes, for at the present, our strugglings were in vain, restoring him to the truth faith. He wants so badly. And I think that I know that is a pattern for me.
Yeah.
I know that's a pattern for many of us that, it's almost like the bottom of the triangle, right?
Yes.
Where we have to take care of our own needs and get to the point where we know that we are spiritually self-reliant, I guess, or that we know that we have received a remission of those sins or mistakes, whatever that we have. But then our natural inclination when we allow God's power to come into our life is to reach out and expand beyond. I love the great quote by Joseph Smith where he says, this is not a perfect quote, but he says, a man filled with love of God is not content with blessing his family alone, but reaches out to the whole world, anxious to bless the whole human race. That's what you're seeing here with Enos. He's expanding, and I think that the Lord is expanding his view until he sees every person, every eye, as a brother, as a sister, as someone that he just loves and wants to help in this process of receiving this joy that he also just felt. It's his father, it's Lehi partaking of the fruit and wanting to share it with everyone.
Yeah, that is so.
Right?
I love Sharon Hayes is kind of a Book of Mormon scholar that I've appreciated so much, and I love how she described kenosis, like as a theological concept. This emptying out of one's soul. So she'll describe, here's Enos. He's made whole, which is health, which is that it comes from that same word, I'm healed. And then this emptying out of himself, pouring out his whole soul for others. And the way that covenant, I think it's like this self-emptying after being made whole catalyzes this commitment to the life and welfare for others, their well-being, which I think is that path, right, that you've described.
I love that. I mean, we can continue on with Enos. I love this last part, and you're talking about this kenosis, kind of this reaching out. I love verse 27. At the end of his life, I always love reading the end of the life experiences of prophets, leaders, women, etc. Yes.
What do
most
they feel?
Yes. I love verse 27 and this phrase, speaking of rest, and you're talking about your mom and things. I soon go to the place of my rest, which is with my Redeemer, for I know that in him I shall rest. I mean, you see this struggle a page ahead, and now we're seeing this incredible rest now.
Yeah.
But the rest is interesting. And then he continues, and I rejoice in the day when my mortals shall put on immortality and shall stand before him. Then shall I see his face with pleasure, and he will say unto me, come unto me, ye blessed. There is a place prepared for you in the mansions of my Father. I mean, just this absolute, it's like the opposite feeling almost, this wrestle, this hunger, and then it's the next life, understanding Jesus Christ himself. And sometimes we want that rest so bad right now, but I think that real rest is when we know that we are with our Savior. We have exercised our faith in him. We know that he is there with us. We have times of rest in our lives, but that real eternal rest, I think, is just such a beautiful concept.
He doesn't, Barb, it was powerful for me as you're reading along, where he receives forgiveness for himself. Yeah. And then he's drawn out, as you described, out of his own circle into that of others. And with his own soul, his whole soul, he says, laboring for the promise, seeking a covenant from God that he would help them. And it's not until then, I mean, he's forgiven and all of that until verse 17, where he says, and then my soul did rest. Wherefore my soul did rest. And thinking about that, isn't that the journey of a parent?
Yes.
Where you're like, I am so grateful for the assurance of redemption, but I am super concerned about those I love so much.
Yeah.
And what's amazing is the assurance that he receives is like a 2,800-year story.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like, well, next year you'll all be gathered in the temple and everybody's going to be on the covenant path. And right, it's not that. He's saying, I will fulfill my promise. And Enos, it's going to take a long time in this case for this record that you care about to then enable them to know their Redeemer. But I will do it. I will come for your children. I will come bring them back. I will come for your cousins, right?
Yeah.
This family. And then Enos is like, I can rest. I can trust in this Redeemer's power, and I can rest even more fully when I am in his presence.
And you know, Jenet, I love that. And I love understanding the heart. And again, this is perhaps part of this wrestle and this hunger. It's not that he's saying until my children, until all these cousins and aunts and uncles, until all of my posterity returns, until that point, I won't be happy.
Yeah.
He's happy now.
Yes.
But you can be happy and struggling at the same time.
Yes.
You can have faith in Jesus Christ himself and still mourn.
Yes.
And you can still have a very healthy, fantastic, wonderful relationship with people. Yeah. And still want something better, for them. I just think about how much I love my own children, how much my parents love me, how much we love people. And we recognize that agency is so critical. But the choices my children do not make, and I think this is so obvious, they don't make a beans of difference on how much I love them.
Yeah.
I want better for them. I want to be a better person for them. I want to be able to learn how to teach or inspire a little bit better. And I want to work on, this is my continual wrestle within myself.
Yeah.
But I hope that regardless of any decisions that anyone makes around me, they genuinely know of my sincere love for them, that they can make any choice and they are my friend, they are my sister, they are my brother, they are my child. Does that make sense?
I will love you.
Yes. And I think that that's what we're seeing here with Jacob, and we saw it with Enos, we saw it with Jacob and then Enos and Nephi. And that's the beauty of this for me, is they love them so much. They just want the best. But in the moment, they are going to love them the very best that they know how.
Yeah.
I love President Hinckley one time. He just said, pray to know how to better love. Just not to love more, but just to better love.
Yeah,
right?
love in truer ways.
Yes.
It's so, you have to wonder, right through mortality, this gap between what is and what we hope will be.
Yeah.
And it does seem like there's something essential in mortality in experiencing that gap.
Yeah.
In a host of ways, but including for those that we love and want better for, and maybe for ourselves, want to change and to have already become better.
Yeah.
And it does seem like that there's something about that gap, the irreconcilable, that makes the redemption seem all the more remarkable and sweeter. Like he will do his work. He will perform the miracle. He will redeem me. He will redeem you. He will provide all that's needed in this story of redemption for us.
I think this idea here of just hungering and really reaching out to people, hungering for God in our lives, but also hungering to bring people back.
Yes.
The care that we have for other people.
Yes.
This wrestle.
Which, Barb, I know you love this part, but how it talks about the power of the record.
Yes.
The language in passing this on. And I kind of marvel at these books where you have these individuals passing on this record, and they'll say, we've tried to reach out to the Lamanites. I mean, here's Enos saying,
yeah.
I've wanted to be part of this covenant gathering, and there's no access. They are not hearing us. And so what we'll do is we're going to keep passing on the record. We're going to keep passing on this record, knowing that God will fulfill his covenant. Almost like the record is the covenant, getting one generation closer every time to the fulfillment of his promise that he will gather this family back.
Jenet, you've done so much on covenant relationships and a lot of your research, and even your talk. You have a great BYU devotional talk that I just love on that topic. And when you're talking about these covenant relationships, so as I look at this, where Enos, I'll just kind of walk us through a few of these verses if it's okay. So obviously we're talking family, but I think this relationship to the language, and he's not just talking about language, Egyptian, we're not just talking about English for us. We're talking about the language of our family, the language of our tradition, the language of who we are. So in Enos chapter 1, obviously, verse 13, we start seeing this. He wants his record preserved, right? And we see this again in verse 15, preserve our records. And 16, and I had faith and I did cry unto God that he would preserve the records. And then I love this too. He covenanted with me. That he would bring them forth. That's how important these records are. It's a covenant. Then you turn to Jerem. And we see right off the bat in verse 1, the genealogy. And then verse 2, I don't have to go through all these, but I mean, for us, for our listeners, I would even suggest marking these and how important this is. And 2, we're seeing that again in verse 7. You know, these leaders are going forward in this record. And you see this in verse 12. You see it in verse 14. It ties into Omni chapter 1. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And then, of course, we get to Mormon, and he is the one who is writing. So we see this in the words of Mormon in verse 2. He says, but may God grant that we may survive them, that he may write somewhat concerning them. And then in verse 3, we see written. This whole idea of this written language and this covenant language, this record, this gathering is kept and preserved through this record, this covenant record of these people.
Yes. So you see in the title page of the Book of Mormon, right? Moroni's promise that they might, and all of it, that they might know of the covenants of the Lord. And what he has wrought for their fathers. And to the convincing, so this restoration of that lost, the Lamanites, the Nephites who had been destroyed, this restoration of them, and to the convincing of Jew and Gentile, the rest of the world, that Jesus is the Christ, and it's going to happen through the record.
It's being fulfilled today as the Book of Mormon has been restored. It's come through the earth as people have taken. Missionaries especially have taken this book throughout the world, and this record that they have written has been restored, and God has kept his promise.
Yes, so we get to see it.
We get to see it. I also think it's important on this record. We are a record-keeping people.
Yeah.
We are. I remembered some of my interfaith relations, especially with my friends that are Jewish, and just talking about how they and us, we are a people of the book. We are a people of the record, right? Which I think that's fascinating. I also find it interesting in the book of Omni in verse 17, where we learn about this group of people now who are coming, and this is going to lead us into Mosiah in the future.
Yeah.
But I think this is an important distinction where this people, the children of Lehi and Sariah, are keeping a record. But in verse 17, we learn about this new group of people, and he says, it came to pass that Mosiah discovered them. They had become exceedingly numerous. Nevertheless, they had many wars and serious contentions and had fallen by the sword from time to time. And their language had become corrupted, and they had brought no record with them. And they denied the being of their creator. and Mosiah nor the people of Mosiah could understand them. And then in verse 18, but it came to pass that Mosiah caused that they should be taught in his language. The importance of keeping records, the importance of writing our testimonies, or the importance in our day, there's so many ways we can keep records besides just writing. We have videos, we have ways to chat with other people. There are other ways, but I can't stress the importance of keeping that covenant language and keeping that record for future generations. These people were giving their lives for these records, literally. And we're blessed because of their willingness to write. Sometimes it is hard to take time to keep a record, especially of those sacred things. But I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for us. If we don't keep our record of our lives and our testimonies, who's going to write that for us?
Yeah. And you think how much of our parents' lives and their witnesses, like I think of my parents' testimonies, and I know you feel this way.
Yeah.
And their words that imprint themselves, I can hear my mom calling on an Easter when I'm far away from home, struggling. And Dad picks up the phone, so kind. I said, can I talk to Mom? The first word she says to me is, he is risen.
Oh.
And I can hear her bearing witness, right? All has been overcome. Do not fear. And how powerful that record, right, in its varied forms is, that they may not see all of their children staying carefully on the covenant path, but they are leaving the record that assures that covenant will be fulfilled, which is what Enos is receiving from the Lord, right?
Yeah, and I love that he says in here, according to your faith.
Yes.
I mean, we want so much for everyone else to have this faith, but I love that there is the promise to the righteous covenant-making people that according to your faith, this will happen. He says in here, your fathers asked for the same thing. And I would say your mothers asked for By fathers, I think they're often saying parents, but this is what they wanted as well. And it's going to be okay.
It's going to be okay.
Trust the Lord, you know? And I think that this faith leads then to trust. When you know Jesus Christ, you're more apt to trust him. And he is saying it's going to be okay. It's hard sometimes to have that trust. It's hard to be in the wilderness. It's hard to be in that frontier trying to figure things out. But that is where faith is grounded, when we really just keep pushing forward and we just move on. Then verse 26, it's just such a powerful testimony again at the end of another life. And now, my beloved brethren, I would that ye should come unto Christ, who is the Holy One of Israel, and partake of his salvation and the power of his redemption. Yea, come unto him. And this is often one of my all-time favorite scriptures, and offer your whole souls as an offering unto him, and continue in fasting and praying, and endure to the end. And as the Lord liveth, you will be saved. I don't think he's just saying you, a person. He's talking about everyone. You will be saved. You're going to be saved. Do these things. Recognize all that God has given you. Continue in fasting and praying. Do what you can. You and those you love are going to use their agency. And because of Jesus Christ, we can come unto him, and he will be the one, not you, but he will be the one who saves these beautiful children. Jenet, we like to end our podcast with a very simple question. And it's as simple to ask, but maybe not as simple to answer. And the question is just simply, how have you been changed through your study of the Book of Mormon, or through the Book of Mormon itself, the principles associated with this beautiful book?
Wow. Tender to think about. I have memories as a child of reading the Book of Mormon and feeling its power and knowing it was real. But maybe the longer that I live, as we're studying in Come Follow Me this week, it talks about the Book of Mormon as a book of conversion and all the stories of conversion. And I think it offers this beautiful combination to us. It teaches us what conversion looks like and what Christ can do in the lives, all of our lives, in the various stages that we are developmentally, and the people that we love. And so it teaches us his power to convert and what it looks like. And then it says, and I will gather my children home. And here, this book we hold in our hands is his breaking through heaven to earth in a most miraculous way, making his arm manifest and saying, I will fulfill my promises. So what a gift.
Jenet, thank you so much for being with us today again. And we'd like to thank you as well. Thank you for being with us here on Grounded. We've been able to study Enos through the words of Mormon. We appreciate you coming and sharing your scriptures with us. We appreciate you opening your scriptures and being a part of this discussion. We also would like to invite you to continue to share this podcast and these scriptures, especially in your testimony with others, as we gather together into one of those things that are Christ. We'll see you next week on Grounded.